you. Hi, everybody. My name is Moshe Zadka. My website is corporatism.com, where you can find every way contacting me known to humankind. And today I'm going to talk to you about documentation by and for developers. Feel free to send messages, questions, either on the chat or on Slido or on Slack. I probably won't be looking at them until the end, but feel free to ask them whenever you want to, and I will try to get a few minutes at the end to see if there's anything interesting to address. I do want to start with an acknowledgement of country. I live and I'm giving this talk from the San Francisco Bay Area Peninsula, which is the ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone people. So when you write docs, the first thing you need to remember that you're writing it for someone. If nobody is going to read them, it doesn't help that you write them. It might make you feel good, but it's ultimately a wasted effort. And if someone is going to be reading them, you need to think about who that someone is. And just to be able to give specific examples, let's say that you're writing documentation for an alternative configuration management system, something that is like Ansible or Salt or Puppet or Chef, just most of the doc applies, of course, to everything, but this gives us an idea of like what kind of people, because I can actually refer to kind of people who need different kinds of documentation. So the first person that you want to think about when you write documentation is yourself. You are probably going to remember a lot less about the system that you're writing 3 months from now when you are trying to figure out what's going on. This is important to remember. Like, you're an important customer of your own documentation. I have read my own documentation many times. Um, Going a little bit outwards, most projects are not a one-person project. You're probably working with a team. The team tends to have a lot of context. This is, either their main job or one of the main things they're doing. They've updated. You can assume a lot of context for the documentation that is supposed to address the team. On the other hand, a lot of projects have contributors that are less involved, have less context. They're still working on the core product, but this might be the first time they've ever tried to send in a patch. So obviously they'll have less context. If kind of going a little bit broader is developers, people building on the code. And this is a distinction from the core team or even the contributors. In the example of a configuration management system, these will be the people developing, say, Ansible plugins or Salt plugins. They're still writing code. They're writing code in probably the same language because plugins tend to be the same language, but they don't really care about the core. They have some sort of differentiation between their code and the code that you're working on. And finally, users. And yes, the title of the talk is Documentation for and by Developers, but in many cases, your users are kind of like developers, right? The users of a configuration management system write YAML files. They'll sometimes write, say, a Jinja template, right? That's a full programming language. They're going to have to debug those files. They probably are going to read the documentation. This is also a kind of documentation that you will want to write. So a lot of the systems that we develop, the end consumer of them is also a technical person who's basically writing some sort of code. And I kind of try to lay it out in like these concentric circles to show that all of these people will probably need different things. And it's really important to remember that these are not actually different people. Someone might be, might start out being a user, but then they need to write a plugin, right? Suddenly they're wearing a different hat. But after they're done with the plugin, they'll go back to writing YAML files that use the plugin. So they kind of taken put on hats pretty quickly, right? Someone who's a user might find a bug in your system and need to contribute a patch. Someone who's in the core team might have their day job as a professional service developer, and they're gonna be a user a lot of the time working on customer stuff. So these are not necessarily different human beings. This is a role they play. This is a hat. And we can talk about hats, we can talk about people, but there is actually a standard term for this concept. And this concept is a persona. A persona is a term that I borrowed from user experience development because it applies here as well. Documentation, reading documentation is a kind of a user interface, right? You're caring about the experience of the person reading that. So the important thing about personas, they tend to be extremely specific. You name them, you give them a job, you sometimes give a specific age and a specific place of residence. You know exactly who they are. And it's very, very concrete what they're trying to do, right? And this is an important tool in user experience design, and it is an important tool in documentation writing because you need to remember your audience. And having someone very, very specific that you can ask questions about is super important. It's actually pretty good if when you're starting to write a document, in the source code of the document, you will document the persona in as much detail as you can, so everybody working on the document can remember who they're writing for. This way, when there's discussions about whether this is a good document or not, the criteria is at least somewhat clear. Is this helpful for this persona? So now you've thought a lot about who you're writing for. You have a persona, you know what they know, you know what they need to do. It's time to start figuring out how to write a document. So you want to think a lot about what do they know? What do they already know when they start to read the document? And what do they remember from that? And those are distinct things, right? You can, you know the solution of the quadratic equation because you learned it in high school, but you probably can't remember it offhand. And this is important when you write your document. Are you writing it as a reminder for something? Are you telling them something new? Or are you writing something that they already know, in which case it's probably not useful and you can delete that and get to your point. So it's really important to have in mind, again, the concrete persona and what does that persona know? What does the persona want? They're probably not printing out your PDF and using it as their bedtime reading. They're probably reading it with a specific goal in mind. And again, once you have the persona, you can think about what kind of goals they have and why they're reading your document. What are they missing, right? Again, like the reason they have a goal in mind, and if they could achieve that goal without reading your document, they would have done that. Reading your document is wasting their time in some sense. So you want to think about what specific step are they missing to get to their goal for which they're going to start reading your document. And again, the more specific you are, the better you are at addressing that. And then you want to think about how they're going to scan your document, how they're going to look at it. Um, because documents tend to be long and maybe only a specific part is relevant to them, they're gonna do Control F and look for specific keywords. They might Google for search terms. They might use some local search engine depending on how you're deploying your documents. And you want to think about which words you want to use that they look for, right? And you want to make, of course, sure that you use these words. You want to make sure that you bold them or emphasize them in some way so that it's easy to scan and see that they hit the right place. You want to carefully think about which words are really important and which words mean to them stuff. And that's important because you have to remember the perspective of the persona, which is not necessarily the perspective of yourself as a developer of the core system. So once you know the persona and you know what they look for, there's different kind of documents you want to write. The first document that is extremely useful if you've ever used something, is Quick Start. That's a generic guide. It tries to get you to the point where you can run the system in a minimal configuration as fast as possible. It's really good for making something work, which is important because if someone has never used your system, this is how they measure how hard it's going to be to use. The easier and more specific and detailed and clear you can make that, they'll have something working. But because of that, it's not bad for like troubleshooting complicated configurations or figuring out once you're beyond that minimal configuration what has gone wrong. So the quick start has its place. It's good to write it, and it's important not to try to go into those places when you write it. The next kind of document that you want to often write is a tutorial. A tutorial guides the user through a specific path. Again, it's important to be specific. You cannot write a tutorial that diverges infinitely. That will make it extremely hard to write, extremely hard to read, and nobody is gonna enjoy that. You want to figure out a specific use case that is ideally pretty common and move along that path. It's really good when you have a common use case. If you have two or three use cases that cover 80 or even 60% of what your users are used for and they're reasonably specific, a tutorial is great for that. Again, you might have to have three tutorials, one to use it in configuration A, one to use it in configuration B, and that's again good. Then you have specific paths that people can find the right path for them. Tutorials tend to be advanced for advanced use cases because once you get there, it tends to diverge a lot. That's almost the definition of advanced use cases. So this is important. Don't try to cover the advanced use cases in tutorials. The last kind of, oh, not the last, there's another kind of document called the example, right? And that's a really thoroughly documented sample. And it's important. It's not just, you write some code and you're done. You have to document what decisions you've made. Why are you putting those lines? Because these are the things that people will want to change. So it's really important to remember that you want to document that sample. It's really good to enable copy paste. And this is not something to be ashamed of. Often, for good or bad reasons, the minimal thing you need to do to interact with your system is not that small. It's pretty nice to be able to just copy paste that and know that it's supposed to work. This means that if it doesn't work, you have an installation error or something like that, and it's not a problem with you not understanding the documentation. It's really bad if you don't have a specific use case. Ideally, the example gives a specific use case. It doesn't have to be a super popular use case, but it does have to be useful in something. Another kind of document is a reference. This is, I think, the usual thing people think when they write documentation. And ironically, it's the first thing they write, even though it's the last thing that people will tend to read. Because if you're coming to a new system, it's really hard to make sense of the reference. You have no idea what you're doing. You have no idea which is the important parts. And every system has the things that are more important and things that are less important. The reference does not make that decision, right? The reference has to document what each thing means or does. You can play a little bit with the ordering, but you're not going to be that helpful. It is important to have it, of course, because ultimately, once people are done with the tutorials and the quick start and the examples, they'll want to figure out, well, what actually does that mean? What kind of strings are allowed here? Is this the right place to put a counter? Whatever. It is important to write it, but it is important to not overemphasize the importance in it, especially if you have limited time to write documentation and you need to prioritize different things. It's really good for answering specific questions. It's also really good for troubleshooting because when you have a parameter, you can say, if this parameter doesn't fit, this is the exception you're gonna get, or these are the error messages that you should expect. References are great for troubleshooting. They can say this function tends to fail in this way. This is amazing. They're really bad at getting started fast. You have this huge thing, and you have no idea what's first, where am I looking. So remember, it's not great for that. It is good at what it does. The FAQ, the frequently asked questions, is another form of documentation that you want to think about writing if you have a new system. But when you write it, make sure that the F is actually F. It has to be frequently asked questions. The most common failure mode in when writing documentation, and especially when writing the FAQ, is instead of writing the questions that you expect, you're answering the question you want to get. That is nice, maybe for like your internal feelings about how you feel about your system, but that is not going to help the people who are reading. And the typical example that I always have in mind is this good for X, or what is this good for? And then you say it's good for the X, Y, Z. That's probably not a frequently asked questions. Unless the X is very, very specific and you can say yes or no in these cases. The more frequently asked questions, just look at Stack Overflow for any given topic. It's usually this thing is failing in this weird specific way with this error message. What am I doing wrong? Especially if you can actually copy paste a reasonable error message into the FAQ, you have made a great document for search engines, because now people can copy paste their error message into the search engine, or copy paste random words from the error message into the search engine and happen on the question that actually answers their problem. And this is how you know that an FAQ is really thinking about the person who is reading it. Are the questions actually going to be useful? So it's really great when you have common stumbling blocks. You can predict some, because you can think about, like, which kind of errors someone who is not familiar, right? If like a string parameter has to be a very specific format, if an integer has to be in a specific range, if unless the system is configured accurately, you start spewing error messages. These are going to be common stumbling blocks. Even before you get them, you can probably assume that they're going to be frequent. Of course, it's really great if you have a process that will update the questions as you actually get feedback. Looking at Stack Overflow, for example. And some people just use Stack Overflow for their FAQ, and there's trade-offs there. It can range. Like, the FAQ is really good because you control it. You control the actual answer. And it's really hard to make sure that Stack Overflow will give the answer that you want. Often answers in Stack Overflow are the quickest workaround, and those end up being quickly accepted. The FAQ is ideally managed by you by some source control, and you can actually answer the right questions. Do not use the FAQ for advocacy. It's a bad advocacy tool. If you want to do advocacy for your project, this is great. There are places to do that. I'm not covering them in this talk because this is not an advocacy talk. Um, but for example, using blogs, right, or different publishing platforms on the internet, going to podcasts, all these things are great for advocacy, for explaining to people that your solution will solve the problem. The FAQ is not where you want to do advocacy. It's really, really annoying to the people who are looking into the documentation to go to the FAQ, and instead of seeing questions that are addressing their problems, which they've already decided to use your solution, you can go past the advocacy. Now, the best way to actually get someone to like your product is not to convince them that your product is great, is to actually solve the problem fast. Avoid any sort of advocacy in the FAQ. It's a really easy trap to get to, which is why I'm talking about it so much. So that when you see someone trying to check in some advocacy into the FAQ, you can give them the appropriate feedback. Now that you've written, do you know what kind of document you're going to write? Sure, it's going to contain a lot of words. You're going to write prose, but you're also going to add some things to make it nicer, to look nicer, to have more fun with it. The most common one is screenshots, and screenshots are great. They're great because the ROI. You're already probably running your system, at least in some test configuration, even if not in full production. There is nothing easier than once you've already writing your system, especially if you're already checking that your document is correct and you're running it in the situation that the document is talking about, taking a screenshot, saving the image, and then putting it in your document is great. And that's the investment part. It takes, less than 20 seconds to add a screenshot to your document. And the return is great because people can see what the screen is supposed to look for. If you put a little bit more investment, highlighting with a red circle the important part of the screenshot, they know where in the screen to look for, what to check, and they quickly can know if they made a mistake if it doesn't look like what the screenshot depicts. Diagrams are almost the exact opposite. They're very, very high investment. Even with the best modern tools, it can be very hard to produce diagrams that really look nice. It's just hard objectively. On the other hand, they are great to show relationships between some things, right? If these things map to these things and these things map to these things, diagrams can be great for that. They're really good if you have some sort of structure, right? If you have some file layout or some memory layout or some uh, text format that you want to explain, diagrams can often do that really well to explain at some level. Do not use control flow diagrams. These are never helpful. Write pseudocode. Your readers probably understand pseudocode. If you can write actual code, even better. But if somehow actual code would be more cumbersome than you're willing, writing it in pseudocode is much, much better than like the control flow diagram because pseudocode is just better to explain these things, right? There's a reason why you don't program in these flow diagrams because it's hard. If it was easy, like we would already have a system to write most of our code using that. That's not gonna work. So, and unfortunately, this is a common thing people do with diagrams. So I want to try to warn you away from that. Tables are great. They will for the kind of things that tables are good for. They're not great for the kind of things that tables are not good for, which is laying things out visually. Don't use tables for that. Figure out how to lay things out visually. But when you actually have a table, for example, documenting a truth table of an operator or documenting how inputs relate to outputs, tables are wonderful for that and you should use them. They break up the flow of the prose and they organize information that is easily consumable. The next thing is kind of a contentious point, and I admit I have gone 180 in my life. I used to be extremely anti-lists. I used to think that lists are a tool for lazy people who don't really have time to think about how to structure their prose. I no longer think that, to be very, very clear. I think lists are great. When you have something that is inherently a list of things, putting it in a list form makes it so much easier to consume than starting to figure out where in the paragraph you switch from talking about thing one to thing two. If your list is generic, it doesn't have an order or a specific number of things, bullet lists are great. Number lists are great, especially when you have a list of steps that have to be taken in specific order, which ideally you'll document well. Then you can say, if you fail at step two, then you will only see the problem in step four or stuff like that. This is great. And some lists are what they call title lists or description lists, where there's something and something about it. For example, which operator can be used on which systems or something like that. Those are also a great format for lists. Again, whenever you have something that naturally breaks into a list, it is really good to actually do that. And this is something that I want to emphasize because it's contentious. A lot of people say that it's a lazy writing tool, but it's really not. It's a tool that helps you and helps your reader. Examples. I already talked about the example as a document, which it will sometimes be like a self-contained document, but often you want the example to be part of a document. You're already writing some quick start, and then you have to put 3 lines of copy paste that. And at that point, you have a weird trade off that you want to think about when you're writing the example. How much do you want the example to be self contained versus succinct? And I guess the most common example I think of when I think of these examples is, are you going to be putting import lines in Python or the equivalent in other languages, say using lines in Java or not? They have very little pedagogical structure, purpose, right? They don't serve any teaching thing. This is probably not the point of your example, but they do make it harder to adapt the example directly. And this is a trade-off. This is a subtle trade-off. And at that point, you should ask yourself, why am I doing this example? What is it here for? What is the persona I'm writing for will need from that, and go by that. I don't have a generic solution, but I do want you to struggle with that when you write an example and think about the right solution. And it's okay to make a temporary decision and to revisit later, but it is something that needs to be explicitly decided. Then I think you want to think about where, um, when you're writing a document, is for things to pay rent, right? Why am I having sentences double here? Why is this question mark here? And this is an example of like something that doesn't pay rent, right? You want to make sure that every single sentence is there for a reason. It's there to advance the purpose of the document to be usable for the person who's reading it. Every single word must serve purpose. And this is, as you're editing and as you're writing, remember to think about it when you're looking at your documentation. It's really hard to write documentation because the best person to write documentation is the person who knows a lot about the system. On the other hand, if you know a lot about your system, then it's hard to decide whether this is something that is easy to understand because you already know that. And unfortunately, unlike in a lot of other cases, you cannot do automated testing for that. There's no robot that will, uh, flag your PR for not being accurate. This means, especially with documentation patches, if you are managing them with some source control system, you want to make sure that a human person actually reads it, tries to think about the appropriate persona and whether they will understand it when they read it. So this is sometimes hard to do because people have jobs, right? Like the person you're asking for feedback has their own task, and figuring how to make this happen in your organizational structure is not necessarily easy. Again, depending on whether it's an open source project or uh, um, inside the company, there's different ways you can address that. But it's important to figure out how you're going to address it in your project and then follow that. When you write documentation, you want to make sure they're accurate, which means you want to make sure that you're concrete, that you say exactly what you mean, and you want to make sure that what you say is actually correct. Test that again, ask for feedback, see if that means. Um, One thing that is different between documentation and code is that redundancy is not bad. You want to repeat yourself at least a little bit. A document that only mentions something once and assumes at that point the reader knows it and can depend on it is not great, because it means if the human person who read this, like was a little bit hungry or a little bit distracted, or maybe some kid, now that we're all waking from home, was just asking a question when they were reading that sentence and they skipped to the next one without fully absorbing it, they're going to be lost if the rest of the document depends on that sentence. So you want to make sure that you have some redundancy. The usual guideline or rule of thumb when talking about redundancy is the rule of three. It's a good redundancy, I guess, in production systems, right? So that you can survive on two-thirds of the system if one goes down. And it's also a good guideline for documentation. So you want to repeat yourself. And the usual way to follow the rule of three is say what you're gonna say, then say it, then say what you said. And of course, if you just repeat things three times, it will look weird. So when you are being redundant, you want to think about how to phrase it. For example, you want to say, here is an explanation of X, and then explain X, and then this explanation of X showed you that something. And this way, you have three different approaches to that explanation. And if someone doesn't get the third one, for example, they'll explicitly go back and make sure that they understand it. So this way, your redundancy actually helped the person understand it better. You also want to make sure that the document is organized. It's really hard to read something that has no reasonable order. And at the very minimum, the order has to obey some sort of dependency rule. You cannot present something that depends on something presented later. Now, sometimes that's near impossible. But in those cases, first think about, are you actually in those cases? Maybe the system is too complicated. Maybe you need to, you know, refactor that. If two things depend on each other, figure out the core thing that they depend on and put it in the beginning. There's different ways of thinking about it, but try to make sure you obey dependency. If you really, really can't obey dependency, say, this will be something we will explore later, and maybe give a short summary of that. You want to make sure that at least you are remembering that a human person will read this in an order that's linear in time. And right next to order is cohesion, right? Even if you follow a dependency rule, right, you don't want an arbitrary serialization of your directed acyclic dependency graph to be the order of the document. You want to have cohesion, right? If three topics, even if they don't depend on each other, all are closely related, probably addressing similar use cases, you want to keep them close together in your document, regardless of how your document is laid out. So now that you have your document organized in a specific way and the order is correct and the cohesion thing is good, you want to make sure that every single section and subsection has a clear title. And the reason, again, because often these documents tend to be very, very long, and people are going to scan the table of contents and will try to figure out if this is what they need. If your title is not correct, your document almost might as well not have been written. They're probably not going to find the right place, and they'll be frustrated and just go directly to your FAQ or to Stack Overflow. You want to make sure that you approach the learning flow in a slow enough way. I'm sure you've all seen this meme where to draw an owl, there's like draw a circle, and I'll draw the rest of the owl. And unfortunately, this is the reason why it's a meme is because this is a common experience for people who read documentation. We have done this minimal thing, and we're sure that you all understand it. And now, here's the most complicated use case I can. Remember that people need small steps, right? Like just having the first step be simple and small is great, but all the other steps also have to do that. So remember not to make really big jumps in your learning flow as people are reading your document. You want to make sure your document is unambiguous, and technical terms are useful where they are correct and applicable and understood by the persona you intended. When not, it's sometimes a good idea to just have some sort of glossary or to define the term the first time you use it. But technical terms are not something you want to avoid. when you're documenting those kind of systems, but you want to make sure that your terms are correct, applicable, and understood by whoever it is that needs to understand it. You want to make sure that you keep the scope. You know who you're writing it for because you already made a decision. You know what problem you're trying to solve for them because you already made a decision. Now keep remembering that. It's very, very easy to go and talk about something unrelated, especially because this is a system that in many cases, right, you like or love or care about in some way, even if it's just for work. It's very easy to go, oh, and it can also do this thing. Is this why they're reading it for? If not, then I realize it's hard, but delete all things. This is out of scope. This is hard for authors of fiction works, right? To remove these extraneous scenes. This is like in the noveling world, it's called kill your babies, right? It's hard to do that, but you still should do that. Um, I'm glad you've all kept with me so far. It's been a while, so this is a comic relief section of my talk where hopefully I'll entertain you while teaching by showing you what not to do. So I'll give a bunch of bad examples. Um, Avoid using fancy words. Um, there's a few reasons why you should not use fancy words. First of all, they're not useful other than to make yourself feel better about how much time you spent taking English classes in college. But even more importantly, remember that we live in a very international world, especially now that the world is more open to remote roles for all kinds of reasons. You'll have a lot of people who are speaking English as a second language. Try to use simple words that they are more likely to have learned. You want to avoid making assumptions about what they already know, especially if you're writing that assumption. It means you're probably feeling somewhat uncomfortable about making it. In that case, maybe instead of saying you already know, point to where they can learn more about that. Avoid insulting your users. Now, most people who insult the reader don't intend to, but as I'm sure you've seen on the internet, intent is not magic. The most common way to insult your reader is to use a few words that are unfortunately very, very tempting to use. Simply is one of the greatest words to avoid. What if it's not simple for them? Of course, it's simple for you. You're the person writing the document. You probably have written 5 examples just to figure out exactly how to document it. If you have not already came into writing the documentation after having done it 10 times. I'm sorry. Jest, another really bad word to use. Yes, I realized to use just right callback, taking 3 parameters and decorating the function, but that's because you have done it a few times, and for use jest, it's not necessarily correct for the person who's reading that. Otherwise, they probably would be reading the document. They would be collaborating with you on writing a better one. Obvious, obviously, and variants on that word also really bad. And this is something when I first learned about it, it blew my mind. If it's obvious why you're saying that, you probably don't think it's really obvious. It's obvious to you, but you're writing it. It should be obvious. You should know what you're talking about. Ideally, if you're writing the documentation, saying the word obviously just doesn't help. And I'll note that, like, if you think about this sentence, look at it carefully, and you can remove those words without changing the meaning at all. It'll just be right. So let's read this with removing the bad words. You need to pass, like, all you need is also bad because it means that it's not a lot. So you need to pass a prime argument, Mersenne primes are not a good idea here. This is exactly the same thing in less words, with a lot less condensation and a lot less insult to the person who does not think that finding a prime number is simple and who doesn't think it's obvious why Mersenne primes are not a good idea. Try to avoid being overly verbose. Get to your point. Yes, a little redundancy is good. Saying the same thing over and over again 4 times is not great. Avoid being overly terse. Say something useful. And one place I see that happening is when people don't know, but they're somehow tasked with writing the document. And then, okay, well, I need to document every single parameter, but I've never passed the count. I've always used the default. Well, the count is clearly the count. Right? That, I've done my job. I put a few words. And especially if those words were like to satisfy a robot, right? To satisfy something that checks that every single parameter is document, the robot's happy. This parameter documented. Does it help anyone? Probably not. They already figured that the variable called the count is probably the count. The count of what? What numbers are allowed? I don't know. I've never passed that. Like, and I'm not gonna actually learn. So it's fine not to know, but then put a TBD here explicitly. Put an XXX. Don't put it at all, so the robot will keep complaining and maybe silence the warning, but eventually fix it. This is not helping anyone. Avoid using inexact word. Is this the upper bound, the lower bound? Is it inclusive, exclusive? I don't know. Just said bounds. Probably someone knows. Make sure the words you're writing are exactly describe what it is that you're talking about. Avoid going on a tangent. Uh, um, it's might be important that the performance depends on exactly how you define big O depend notation, and there are several ways to define big O notation, and they're not completely equivalent. But that's probably not what's going to be relevant to the person who's trying to figure out what is the number between 1 and 5 to count to. If it's really important, put it as an explicit aside later. And if you don't think it's important for your persona, delete that. I realize you care about the definition of big O notation. I care about the definition of big O notation. This is like a hobby project of mine to tell people that different definitions are not exactly equivalent and they're talking about different things. But it probably doesn't in, you know belong here. It belongs elsewhere. Don't rationalize, don't apologize. Explaining why you can't have 5 is or like a higher number than 5 is not useful here, right? Like people probably don't care that it made your implementation simpler. I realize you're feeling bad that you don't support 6, but either this is good for the person who writes it, in which case they're not gonna ask why, and if they are, insulting them by telling them that they're weird and like why do you even need to count to higher numbers, it doesn't belong here. Maybe this is a good thing to put in the FAQ. Why can't I have a count higher than 6, higher than 5, and then explain why. That's a good place to explain. You should avoid advocacy there too, but definitely that's not the place to rationalize. Avoid misleading. If you're not supporting any number, don't say that you're doing that. And especially avoid misleading by saying the truth, right? If it's easy to read it and misunderstand, you have not done your job accurately. Now, what ways do we have to write documentation? This is, I think, the least interesting part of my talk, but I do want to cover that because it's something that will matter to you when you're actually writing documentation. What kind of tooling are you going to use? Often people use language native toolings like Java doc or like the Rust internal docs. A lot of languages have those, and sometimes those make sense. That's great. I like the Sphinx system. It does integrate with some language native, which means you can write some of your documentation language native and then go on to continue long form prose. It supports pretty good semantic markup, which says not just this thing should be rendered as code, but this thing is the name of a class, or this thing should be the name of a function, and we'll find cross-reference links. Links are, of course, great to make your documentation more navigable. Uh, Easier to get started with is mkdocs, but it does have less functionality. You can get to the cap where you need more than what mkdocs gives you. So in general, I tend to err on the side of let's spend a bit more time getting started and use things, because I know that the cap is much higher there. You probably want to integrate your document generation with the continuous integration. It's a very minimum. You want to make sure that you build your documentation. If you have some sort of markup language, you want to make sure that you at least don't have syntax error. Usually, it's good to uh, turn on errors and turn on some sort of errors are treated as warnings are treated as errors in your build step, because often those documentation tools by default will try really hard to make sure that they generate some sort of valid output, say HTML, and you don't want that. You want it to shout at you if you did something wrong, probably because that will render not in the way you expect, and you want to make sure that it does render in the way you expect. Some sort of medium is links and checks. For example, the insulting words at least are reasonably grabbable. It's pretty easy to grab them. In that case, you want to make sure that you can silence them when they are actually appropriate to use. Some of these things have linters enforcing best practices. Whatever you can add and put in to help people write good documentation automatically. Again, this is not gonna actually make sure the documentation are good. We have not evolved to the level of AI that some robot will actually tell you if it can understand, but at least it will fix the obvious issues. Um, but again, like I said, robots can't read, right? So a really nice thing to do with continuous integration that tends to, because currently our tooling doesn't make it easy out of the box, so you probably have to play around with that a bit. But when you generate, if somehow you can make something that, say comments on the PR with a link, here is a link to the build documentation after this change makes it. So when people review the PR, they can actually read the documentation as though it was already in and see how it renders, whether it's readable, whether the list looks good or not. Actually, right? This is great to make it easier for people to give you feedback. And I've struggled with that. Like sometimes, because I wanted to make it easy for people to give me feedback, I had to generate it locally and put screenshots. If you can avoid that step for people, that'll be great. That means the feedback is more useful to the person writing it, and it's easier to give that feedback as someone who's tasked with giving that feedback. If you do have code examples, make sure they're tested. Now, I talked earlier about the fact that you often want to skip some import lines, maybe some setup. So a lot of these systems, for example, in Sphinx, you can say select only lines 5 through 10 from an example, which means you can put the setup in your actual code, make sure it runs, and integrate it somehow with your unit testing framework, but you don't have to worry about um, uh, it's showing the import lines in the actual document. So this is a good trade-off if your tooling allows for partial line selection. Otherwise, you want to figure out some other solution for automated example testing. This is really important because there is nothing worse than an example that when you copy paste doesn't work as is. This is super frustrating. If you've ever encountered that, I feel sorry for you, and don't do it to other people. And finally, you want to figure out how this integrates into your development flow. Do you expect a doc change in the same patch that changed the documentation? And people usually gravitate to yes, but it's not necessarily the best decision. For example, this means the only person who can document something is the person who wrote it, and that's not necessarily the best person to write the documentation change. So make sure you figure out how this interfaces with your documentation, with your development flow, and your team structure and your ultimate goals. And finally, the question is whether you want to put the documentation in the repository with the code or outside. And you might want to give different answers for different kinds of documentation. It's very popular to put the reference together with the code because they change pretty much the same. Tutorials probably shouldn't change that much. If they do, you're going to have a serious backwards compatibility issue in general. Yes, eventually you want to update maybe tutorials to new best practices, but it doesn't have to be a one-to-one. Um, Different kind of guides definitely will want to be outside of the patch because they're written by completely different people or on a completely different schedule. And one of the questions you want to answer that will guide your choices is who's authoring each of those things and how are they related to the person writing the code. So I'm not giving you here answers. I'm giving you here questions that you'll have to answer for your use case. So I'm gonna leave you with a few final thoughts. You want to do it. I hope I haven't scared you. Um, Doing it badly is a lot better than not doing it, but you will do it badly. I hope I gave you a lot of guidelines. Following all these guidelines, especially just out of the gate, is super hard. Your documentation is gonna suck the first few times. That's okay. You'll get better. You'll get better, and your docs will get better. If you never start, you'll never have the chance to write bad documentation and make it better. So I do want to encourage you to do that, even if I scared you during the rest of my talk. And if you remember only a few things from my talk, these are the few takeaways I want to take with you. Who are you writing it for? It's really, really important to know who is going to consume your documentation. It's so common to write something with no obvious consumer, and then it just lies there. You put all this effort and you're not getting any return on your investment. What are you documenting? What kind of thing, well, what kind of document you're writing and what kind of problem you're solving? And finally, how are you going to actually solve that problem? If you think about these things before you even string the first sentence in a document, your document will inherently be better. Not necessarily because you'll be writing it, but at least you'll be trying to solve the right problem and you'll be able to measure it. And it's still going to be hard to start, but you'll at least be going in the right direction. Um, so that's all I have to say as far as my prepared stuff. Now, if the moderator wants to jump in with any questions that I had, I guess I have a few minutes to answer them. Hello. Pa-pa-pa-pam. Let me see if there were questions on the channel. I can try to quickly look. I don't see any question on the channel. Um, Moderator, did we have any question on the Q&A? Let's see if anyone used the Q&A feature. Do we have a Q&A feature? We have a chat feature, but we don't have a Q&A.
There is a Q&A. The audience can send questions to www.slido.com using the event code hash BMDD2020.
Okay, awesome. Yeah. Did we have any questions?
I am watching. I did not receive a question here.
Okay, I see one person potentially writing in room one. Thank you, Andrea, for the compliment. I enjoyed giving it. I hope this helped. I will put my slides, a link to the slides in the room after we're done. It's just a slide, so it doesn't have like the stuff I've talked about, but hopefully it'll at least help as a reminder. I guess I'll wait one more minute to see if anyone else has questions. But if not, then I will give you a few minutes to relax and wait for your next session.
And Moshe, did you say the slides are available for download?
Not yet, but I will make them available right after I'm done and put a link in the BMDD room one.
Sure.
channel.
And that's your answer for Christopher. Okay.
Okay. Okay. Let's wait maybe a few more seconds. I is there a plan to share recordings later? Do you know?
This session is being recorded now. We could get in touch with the UG administrators to see how that works. But this
Okay,
is being recorded, yeah.
awesome. So hopefully, if people came in the middle, um, we will also have the recording because I'm happy to share the slides, but unfortunately, the slides are just slides without a lot of stuff because I kind of like it when people listen to me instead of reading the slides the entire time. So,
Daniel has a comment
okay.
in the slider. When writing code sample, make sure that your word processor does not insert curly codes.
Yes, make sure that your stuff is copy pastable. And this is more than this is actually a good point. And this is not just your word processor, right? Like your entire like documentation build chain can do these things. Make sure that the end result, if people copy paste from what they see into their code editor, works. And this is one example why it's really nice to put generation of the would-be documentation as part of your CI. So when your um, when whoever gives feedback on that checks, they can actually do copy paste and check that the copy paste works. This is a great comment and a great thing to point out. I think I'm anyway almost out of time, and it doesn't look like anyone else has questions. So once again, thank you everybody for listening to me. I really enjoyed giving that session, and I will hang out a little bit in the Slack if you have more questions. Goodbye.